Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 3 strategy. Today we're kind of going to build on last month's strategy, and we're going to look specifically at curriculum today. And so this strategy is called the replacement curriculum goal planner. And I've decided that I want to include a hashtag in with these video strategies so that we can connect us on social media, because I figure if we can post examples of this strategy on Instagram or on Facebook or on Twitter, then we can see other people's examples. So we're gonna see if that works. So if you at the end of this give this a try, this strategy, definitely give it a post, because I think the more that we can see examples of this, the more just the more feedback we can get from each other. And you know what, you can never get too many examples. So just as a little review, last time, we're really talking about inclusion in terms of just building on the places where kids are, because we know that oftentimes inclusion is misunderstood as just place. And so this is really about, like, where are kids, but also why are they there? And I know last time we also looked at thinking about, we start with place, and then the possible purposes within that place are really targeting personal, social, and intellectual purposes, and really focusing on the balance of those three purposes, and because I think there's a lot of kids, and I know myself when I think about some of the students I worked with, sometimes we over-focused on personal and social goals. And so today this strategy is really looking at how to kind of set some intellectual goals, and we're going to tie that into curriculum. But I know that hasn't always been targeted, because for a very long time it was presumed that kids were not competent, especially when they had intellectual disabilities. This is kind of combating a lot of that work around not, first of all, that kids actually, all kids can learn, even if we can't capture it, but also that, how do we create access to academics and curriculum for kids? And I know we talked about that last time. So this is a strategy we looked at last week. It's called the Inclusion Purpose Planner. And I showed you a few examples of how, once you kind of target a place and a teacher, that this can help you kind of zoom in and look at different types of purposes within that context. And so, you could look at that from a classroom perspective, or, activities within a classroom, or throughout the day, a schedule through the day. So it's kind of an evolution of the old IEP matrices that we used to use. Kind of just kind of extends that and adds more detail. So today, we're going to zoom in specifically on the intellectual purpose. Now, you can look at intellectual purposes from two different perspectives. The first is, teaching the thinking around intellect, but we're going to look at how you can create intellectual purposes through curriculum and academics, but not just functional academics, like, looking at how do we connect and make accessible the curricular goals in inclusive classrooms. And so, because this is talking about goals, I want to show kind of how this could connect to IEP goals. So this is kind of the components of British Columbia's IEP, or the Competency-based IEP. And so I know that there are, different versions of individual education or program plans. Usually they incorporate one or more of these components, or just change the order. So this is the one that we're kind of working on in BC, and we started kind of a project a few years ago that looks at what are kind of IEPs, looking ahead. I know I could spend a whole nother episode talking about the evolution of IEPs, and we're going through a really big curriculum shift right now that is really shifting to competencies. And if you know about IEPs, you know that they're not competency-based, they're very functional-based, and I just think that kids are more capable than that. So we're trying to kind of shift the old historical deficit-based model of an IEP to a strength-based model that really targets core competencies. But there's some implications on that may or may not connect to context outside of British Columbia. So I'll kind of walk you through the pieces that do. And if not, I encourage you still to kind of think, how could this fit within your context? Because I think it's definitely possible. So in British Columbia, there's an innovation project that's happening, and we had kind of over 30 districts, teachers in different roles, and parents and administrators administrators kind of give their feedback on, how can we evolve an IEP. And so the one that's happening, there's one of two that districts can choose from. So this is about the competency-based IEP. And so it kind of starts off with a student profile, and then we look at supports grouped as either universal or individualized, which I'll spend another strategy on that. So it's okay. I'll explain that one. Core competency goals, that is the part of the curriculum that BC is specifically referring to, kind of the 21st century learning skills, and they're cross-curricular. And so these are goals that are applied in any setting, and they could also be considered specific to category or disability. So depending on, how your district or context allocates resources and funding, students can be called different things. Sometimes it's codes, sometimes there's no codes at all, and it's more prevalence modeling. But right now, BC is kind of provides funding and supports around categories, although that is being reviewed right now. But the core competency goals, and these are the goals that we're often used to in IEPs, but what we're really trying to do is shift to kind of a more student-driven model as opposed to a teacher-driven model. However, there's another part of the IEP that's a little bit more specific to curriculum, and often these goals weren't included unless they were functional academics, but then functional academics aren't often attached to a classroom, so it wasn't a very inclusive model. And so that's what we're going to look at today, is how do we, support the development of curricular goals. And in BC, we've kind of organized those into two different types. There's supplemental goals or replacement goals. Supplemental goals are for kids that don't have an intellectual disability, and so they're still meeting the same complexity of goal as their peers, but they may need supplemental support around maybe specific literacy or numeracy. Replacement curriculum, though, is kind of an alternate goal that might not be at the same level of complexity as their peers, but it's still under the same big idea. And so that's kind of how we're trying to organizing it in British Columbia right now. These goals you do apply in inclusive classroom context, but because the goal is connected to the classroom, it gives the students and the peers a common goal to work under or work towards. And this, I think, is a really important underlying foundational principle of inclusion, is that it's very, very hard to be in a community if you don't have common goals and vision. And so this kind of tackles the curricular or the learning aspect of it. These are teacher and classroom driven because ideally they're designed with the curriculum plan in mind from the start. I can understand that, classrooms and teachers and planning teams are different places on that continuum of readiness. And so this is kind of an entry point for teachers too, to say, where can we start? But I'll show you more strategies that as time goes on, that will explain how you could make this a more universal process. The difference, though, is that and I'll talk about this a little bit next, but this is it's called a strategic plan, not an explicit plan. And the difference between that is really, it's not about closing the gap in learning. It's about making learning accessible, which is a different approach than sometimes we're used to. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then the last part of the IEP is, assessment, which is also another strategy I'll talk about one day. So today specifically, we're looking at how to support the development of curricular replacement goals. And this is specifically for kids to have a curricular goal in the classrooms that they're in. So in terms of this kind of strategic programming, this is a kind of a debate that happens all the time. Like, which one do kids with intellectual disabilities need? Do they need explicit programming or do they need strategic programming? And to be honest, I think it depends on the kid, but I do believe that all kids need both. We're very used to explicit programming in special education because this is where you're working on those kind of cognitively appropriate developmental skills that are systematic and sequential and, really kind of focusing on bridging that gap, or we're working on those prerequisite skills or the lagging skills that kids are usually showing because they might be behind in their peers if they have a cognitive disability. And so often this might look like literacy goals or like specific communication or functional skills. And so I do think that kids do need this. I just don't think they need it all day. But I think the really important part, especially for kids with intellectual disabilities, is that often these materials aren't age appropriate. I know that when I worked in a high school, a lot of my kids are like, over 15, but in order to meet their explicit programming needs, the materials that were being used were just like, made for kindergarten kids. And so that wasn't really appropriate. And so I just really stress that, even if a kid is just learning their letters, it's really important that we're not teaching them that through like talking animals and paper bag puppets. Like you can teach the letters with anything. And so that's another focus of this is, the content that we're using. You can have content that's both developmentally appropriate and age appropriate. And so that's going to be a theme that you see. For today, though, we're looking at strategic programming, which is not about filling in the gap. This isn't about those kind of sequential instruction, meaning like you can't go to the next step unless you've passed the step before. This is more about how do you take a context. So, whether you're in grade 8 or grade 12, or if it's math or if it's science, and you kind of take that grade level or that curriculum, and how do you make that accessible for everybody or for anybody? And I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding that, if you have kids who have different levels of ability, that you have to reteach grades K to 7 in a grade 8 class. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how do you make grade 8 accessible to anyone, regardless of their cognitive ability. And so that's what we're talking about. But also here, this is also about age-appropriate materials, but these are also content-appropriate. And so, because the reason why that's important is that often kids will be in classes, but and they'll have curricularly appropriate activities that aren't age appropriate, or they're not connected to the content of their peers. And very much this is your perfect example of integration, where a kid might be physically in a math class, but they're kind of working on their own booklet on the side while the other peers are working on more complex curricular goals. And so this is not that. This is about how do we find a goal that all the peers can connect to, so that it's not just kind of, a curricular integrated setting, which is not what the goal is here. So in terms of creating this replacement curricular goals, there's going to be kind of a sequence that I take you through. And I kind of like to think about this as, I would actually do this almost as an interview with a classroom teacher, because one thing I realized early in this process when I was a support teacher in the school that I was in, which was grades 8 to 12, is that a lot of the teachers I was working with had never had kids with cognitive disabilities in their class before. And so they didn't really know what to do. But then I also realized that I didn't have the curricular expertise to be able to make them appropriate goals. And so it was a really significant moment when we kind of realized we needed each other. This is absolutely a curricular model. And so I kind of went to the teacher with these questions, and I would almost interview them. It didn't take a long time, but I really felt like I was the facilitator of the conversation for the teacher to guide this conversation. And so this is kind of this, I would kind of talk to them about, so if they're in a science class, for example, a science 8 class, I'd be like, okay, so let's think of a unit that's coming up this term. What's a big idea? What do you want everyone to learn? What might this look like for individual needs? And so it was kind of like a guided conversation. But really, I took all the information. So I was almost the teacher's scribe. And so I would go to them. I wanted to make this process as easy as possible, so that, it was seen that, teachers who opened their door, that they got more support. And that was really, really important, because there's a lot of situations out there where we kind of open the door, put kids in, and we say, teacher, become the expert in everything. And that's not what this is. Like, I don't think I've met anyone who knows everything about every kid, but I think we do collectively, we can meet the needs of all kids. And so this was a really good example of that kind of the collaborative expertise that's needed to be able to create a meaningful, inclusive education program. So here's the template, and I'll walk you through this, and I'll give you some examples. And so this template, what this is really good for is determining strategic replacement curricular goals for an IEP. But this particular template, though, it's kind of like if you're doing your taxes, you don't submit the working pages to your taxes, you just submit kind of the taxes itself. So this itself isn't the IEP, but it's kind of a working template that can help you to get an IEP specific to a particular context. And so when this was kind of developed, we were working at a high school, and we were realizing that like one IEP for every setting wasn't really making a lot of sense, because they were just kind of social. I was kind of saying this before, but social and personal goals, but none of them were place-based, which is why we talked last time about the importance of place-based goals. And so these were kind of like little satellite documents. And so, in the school I was in, there was, say, 4 classes in a day, or 4 classes in a term. There would kind of be like 4 little mini IEPs that were connected to that home document. So we kind of called them satellite documents, and we referred to them as one-page IEPs for a really long time. But this is kind of the process that we would go with teachers. So kind of the first question, what's a topic or theme that you're going to be working on this year or this unit or this term? Why is this unit important? Now, this is where you need your curricular teachers, because they know this. I don't know this, because this is also going to give you your big idea. Like, what's the thing you want your kids to remember in 10 years from now? Like, why does this matter? How does this connect to the world? Our curriculum BC, they give us some really, really great big ideas to draw from. So if you're not sure, that's a really good resource. I know other educational systems are starting to develop those, but also Google is a great reference for that too. And so once you kind of have the topic and the big idea, your next question is going to be, okay, so what do you want all your kids to like know or be able to do by the end of this unit? So I like to call this my goal for all, and that's kind of connected to the planning framework called the planning pyramid, which I will also do on another strategy one day. But this is basically the most accessible grade level goal that you want all your kids to know. And so this can be as specific as an actual learning standard, because what we're trying to do here is that the goal or the learning standard is actually the same for all kids, but it's the objective that we get to be accessible. So you can kind of see on this framework on the left-hand side, it says, what do you want everyone in your class to get out of this unit? That's your goal for all. And then the access point is really where this gets specific for the individual. And so the access point is, what might this look like for a specific student? And then this is the objective to the IEP. So the goal is actually common to everybody. And so then the next question is, okay, well, what class resources and materials are you using for this unit? And then thinking about that student in mind, what resources and materials will we need so that, a particular student can access these curricular goals? I like starting with the class first, because often, I know when I first started in special education, it was always kind of a retrofit approach of, okay, what's the class doing? Okay, let's make it look for this. Like, it's kind of done after, whereas this is before teaching, so that we can actually get all of these materials prepared before, rather than getting often our EAs or educational assistants to kind of make up something on the spot, which is just totally unrealistic. The last part about this, though, is something new that we're trying. We're trying to shift some of our IEP data collection from quantitative to qualitative, because, we're also trying to shift away from SMART goals. And I'm going to have a whole section on that, but there's no curriculum in the world that's written as a SMART goal. And so it's very, very hard to have a common curricular goal with your peers when one of them is qualitatively measured and the other one is quantitatively measured. Plus, the more time that people are collecting data is less time they're actually working with kids. So we're like, what would data look like if it was more aligned with what the classroom was doing? And so this is another way you can kind of do that. So we're kind of looking at triangulated evidence for all learners. Be like, what are the different ways that you're going to assess student learning in this unit, and how could we align that to the individual student who has an intellectual disability? So I'm going to show you a few examples. The first one that I have is a kindergarten class. And so this is, the gap isn't too big here, but, there's still kids in kindergarten who are going to need access points. So this is a student. Her name is A. Well, that's her initial is A. And so the topic or theme that this teaching team is focusing on is, literacy, but really on the output of literacy. So that creating and communicating. And kind of the big idea here is, that we can share ideas or share thoughts and communicate using pictures and words. And this is directly from the BC curriculum. Asking the teacher, what do you want everyone in your class to get out of this? And the teacher says, I want all the kids to start using letters to communicate. I want them to know that creating is a form of communicating, and that when you communicate, you're using language to share ideas, feelings, and preferences. So those are very, very big. Those are very accessible, but those are still like, that's kindergarten level. And so we had a little one in this class who wasn't quite there yet. And so, we were thinking about how are we going to make that kindergarten literacy accessible for them? And so, the objective for A was, why don't we just really target the letters of her name, focusing on the creating as communicating, but really by following a model. Because the three ways that we're trying to really target for communication is visual language, oral language, and written language. And so knowing that, teaching A as many of those as possible, but if she's not ready to write, she can absolutely, visually describe that or visually show that or communicate that orally. And then really in terms of communicating, focusing on her preferences and what she likes and what she loves. So, those are often strategies we use. What are the class resources materials being used for this unit? This teacher uses centers, maker spaces, using a variety of writing tools and materials. This is very typical to kind of literacy in kindergarten. For this specific student, though, some strategies that she will need are because she's needs some support with fine motor skills. So just making sure there's larger tools, and letting her use fingers as a tool. So I know that you can get a lot of really cool materials about, using sand or rice so that kids can still, practice drawing it with letters, but without having the tool be a barrier. And then we thought, a really good material for her is to have a book that's all about her and her favorite things that she could, refer to when she needs to. In terms of assessment, all the kids are assessed in literacy through conferencing. And so we're like, let's just make that the same for A2. So this is like a pretty, like a perfect example. But you can see like the difference between the class and the student. They're actually not that far at all because they're in kindergarten. And so you can see that this could then transfer over to an IEP. So I just have like the IEP framework that is very common all over the place. But this would be kind of two examples of some curricular goals for A in writing. And so AI will know letter knowledge by identifying the letters of her name. So the actual learning standard or goal is the same as her peers, but it's the objective that makes it specific, a specific individual education plan for her. And then in that way, there's a goal that connects them. And then the strategies are exactly what I said on the planning sheet. So you can see like the planning template in the conversation helps to create the actual IEP. So then her second goal, AI will create text by following a model and making choices about the things that she likes to communicate about. So 2 examples, like I say, this one is pretty straightforward. The next example, though, because we're going to start to see as kids get older, that cognitive gap is going to start to increase. And so we're going to have to be more strategic around creating that access point. So this is a grade 4 science example. The student is RM. So what is a topic, theme, or unit that you're working on in this class? This is like that interview with the teacher. So this topic is living things in our local environment. And the big idea is that living things sense and respond to their environment. The question around the goal for all, what do you want everyone in your class to get out of this? And the teacher said, I want everyone to know about biodiversity and how living things respond to their environment. So when we asked, like, what might this look like for RM, we had to kind of take a few steps, like back to look at the big picture to say, what would be kind of some prior knowledge or a bigger idea that is not just that we could start with as an access point for RM, but will also benefit other kids. Because that's the other thing here, is that if it's connected to the goal for all or the goal for other kids, this access point is not just going to be for RM. This access point is actually going to benefit other kids, which is that whole universal design principle. And so for RM, we decided, what if the curricular goal for them is, to know the difference between living and non-living. And, what this class was doing to kind of learn that, they were going out into this school was in this incredible kind of piece of land, and they had access to kind of like they did have access to a forest and a stream and kind of this really lovely ecosystem. And so what they did was they went back on a weekly basis. They chose one thing to observe, and they got to go back to it and see how that living thing changed over time, to see how it responded, which is such an incredible activity. And so some resources that they used was they had tons of text, they had books, movies, website, they had this whole outdoor space for learning. And so what they were doing to collect that observation or information was in a field book. And so it was focusing on observing. So we thought for RM, we would have to somehow have some sort of information, some text about, living versus non-living. And then maybe we were thinking we could connect that to the local place. And that could be part of the activity. So when RM was outside with her peers, she could be taking pictures of things that are living and not living out in the environment. And, really focusing on the vocabulary about that. Also, kind of building a social story about what does it mean to go outside and, staying with the peers. And so, in terms of strategies, it was, some sort of input text around, what is living and the difference between living and non-living. Really, really, really clear and concrete vocabulary visuals of those living and non-living plants and animals, and a social story, and then creating a field book version for her where she could take pictures, even a digital field book. And in terms of assessment for this class, they were doing their field book kind of became part of their portfolio that included some reflections, but then there was also a quiz. And so in a similar way, RM would also have a portfolio, but then we're like, I've actually done with kids where they do a quiz as well. It's just a visual quiz. And so for RM, that visual quiz would be around the vocabulary that they were collecting over the unit. So in terms of RM, this would be her IEP. RM will know about biodiversity in the local environment by identifying living and non-living things. And so the goal, like I say, is the same as her peers, but the objective is where it gets specific to RM. Okay, let's keep going. I have a grade 9 math example, and this one was a tricky one because, I was in grade 9 math, but that was a long time ago. And so, and as you get older in the grades, you realize how much you need these curricular experts, because I don't know what a linear relationship is. I had to relearn it to be able to do this. And so what's the topic? Linear relationships. And so the big idea, using patterns to make predictions in a linear relationship and different ways to represent linear relationships. Like I say, every time I look at this example, I'm like, I need to relearn it again. It's like, we need our classroom teachers. What do you want everyone to get out of this unit? The classroom teacher said, I want everyone to know how to create and read a graph of a continuous linear relationship and why graphs are useful as a visual strategy or a visual tool. So for RA, we asked, what could this look like for him? And so, we kind of thought about, our RA could do a data collection every day and kind of do like a question of the day and represent that information on a graph. But it could kind of start off as a picture graph or a bar graph and then kind of evolve into a line graph. But in that way, it'd be a really good way to practice numbers 1 to 10. So you can see like the cognitive gap here is quite large. But if you start to look at math conceptually, you realize that, you don't need to know how to add to understand graphing. In a similar way, you don't need to know how to multiply to understand the concept of a fraction. And so if you look at math conceptually, it's very, very accessible. But I know a lot of us were taught in a way where math was very linear and sequential and systematic. And if you think about it that way, you can see why this would be hard to do. And so this teacher was very, 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 very good at thinking about math conceptually, and it was such an easy conversation because the teacher was just like, oh, well, RA can do this and RA can do this. So I love this teacher. So resources, technology websites, they were using different versions of tables, and there's some really cool research. The work of Peter Littledahl talks about vertical non-permanent surfaces where, there's classrooms that are kind of making like vertical places for kids to work. And so they have turned walls into whiteboards, and just the engagement and learning that's happening, allowing kids to kind of show their thinking bigger than a page that's 8.5 by 11, and not in a linear way, but in a way that can kind of grow and expand in math, in the ways that math does. So definitely look that up if you're interested. And so what might this look like for RA? Still have versions of tables, but with pictures. An activity, I mentioned this to poll students in class, kind of a question of the day. Having a whiteboard for tallying, and then kind of practicing those, not just the numbers 1 to 10, but the values of 1 to 10 is really the big goal there. In terms of assessment, this teacher was also really trying to move away from just showing learning in one way, like through a test. And so this is a perfect example of a teacher kind of shifting to triangulation and qualitative measures of, it's better for a kid to show their learning in multiple ways than to just show a higher frequency of learning in one way, which is, I know how I was raised. And so the more ways that kids can show their learning, the deeper their learning and the deeper their understanding, as opposed to just how many times they can show their learning. So the 3 ways in math: concrete, pictorial, abstract. And so this teacher wanted all kids to make sure that they showed their learning in all 3 ways, which I think is cool, because I know, there's a lot of kids who can show their learning concretely, but not abstractly, but it's not seen as equal or as valid. So this, I think, is a really nice and important method to teach math. In terms of RA, has some difficulty thinking abstractly, but RA is great at using pictures and videos and concrete learning materials. And so that would be how RA would show their learning. And then, we were thinking that if RA is going to be collecting all of this information about her class's favorite things, then why don't we create like some different versions of class counting books, which is actually a really good example of something that's cognitively and age appropriate. You can still have counting books, but you're not counting bunnies, you're counting, iPhones, or, you're not kind of looking at, like little talking foxes' favorite things, but, like your peers who are 14 years old. And so, you can still make things developmentally appropriate without them being, in like not age appropriate. So that's a really good example. So then this is RA's IEP. RA will know 2 variable linear relations using graphing by, collecting data up to a value of 10, and representing data on a graph. So 2 very, very doable objectives that are considered access points for that grade level goal. Okay, last one. Grade 12. So this is in a grade 12 law class, which is, kind of an option of social studies. So this is BR is the student. So what is the topic, theme, or unit that you're working on in this class? The topic is the human rights law in Canada. Why is this important? Because human rights law affects us in our daily life. What do you want everyone in the class to get out of this unit? This is the goal for all. I want all students to know about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and how it affects our life, but also how it affects different groups of people in Canada. So this is really getting at the equity piece, especially in connection to our Indigenous population. Access point. What could this look like for BR? We kind of zoomed in on one that would be meaningful and affect BR in his life, which is around equality rights, especially in terms of ability and disability. And so, in the Canadian Charter, it's equal right for race, culture, color, religion, sex, age, ability. And so to kind of break those down to say, these are some really, really important, things to know about these different types of people in the world, and that we're all treated equal, that we have rights to make ourselves equitable within this world, and that kind of that whole notion of, we're actually not born equal, but, the supports around equity, strive to make us kind of on level playing field, but it's much more complicated than just, equality rights, but, what is Canada doing to make sure that people are equal, and so BR might not get it to the same level of complexity, but, absolutely could understand that idea that, we are equal and that we deserve the support that we need. So what are the resources and materials Textbook, movies, articles. They had a guest speaker come in. What resources, materials will BR need? We wanted to create a text about equal rights for BR. And the tricky thing about this is that often these texts don't exist. Like, we have to create them. When I was school-based, this was a big part of our role, working with our EA staff, our educational assistants, to be like, okay, we need to create text that's, going to work for the literacy level of BR, but we have to also make it age appropriate and content appropriate. That was actually my most favorite thing to do. And then just really targeting vocabulary that was concrete and visual, which, as you know, like, if the topic is equality and looking at different types of people, that's absolutely visual and concrete. So this is actually cool, though, because how the law students were showing their learning was through a comparative essay. And so we just said, you know what, BR can also write an essay, but we'll make it a visual essay. And we actually paired BR up with another student, and BR, another student who was kind of targeting this particular equality law. And so BR kind of was working on the visuals for that essay. So very, 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 very aligned. And so the IEP goal for the law class, BR will know the Canadian charts of rights and freedoms by identifying different ways to be equal in Canada. So that would be the IEP goal. So you can see, like, if BR is in multiple classes, you would kind of have these little mini kind of place-based IEPs that are curricular that would kind of follow them around. So these little satellite goals. So the last thing I'm going to show you is this part here. This access point is, it takes some practice because I know when I started learning about disability and taking courses in my special education program, it was very, very much focused on the explicit instruction. And I didn't really get taught about this idea of strategic instruction, which is, how do we kind of strategically make curriculum accessible? So I have some tips here. And honestly, this just takes practice. So this is just collected from some colleagues over time. So here's some tips for creating these access points. So first of all, the more connected a goal or an objective is about a kid, the more accessible it's going to be. So, that idea of personal relevance. So, make it about them, make it about their family, make it about what they love to do, make it about their community. And the more it's connected to the person, the more accessible it's going to be. The other thing that's important to remember is that even though a student or an individual cannot demonstrate or communicate thinking at a certain kind of level, it doesn't mean that they can't understand at a higher level. I mean, I think, we know this in the world of kind of typically developing learners. That's why we read books to kids at a higher level, because that's how they're learning. They're learning behaviors that they're going to have to do eventually. It's why we read to babies. We don't read to babies expecting them to read back to us. But often with kids with disabilities, what I find is that we kind of stay within, either their reading level or below their communication level, or below their communication level. And I think it's important to remember that when we're writing these goals, especially when we're developing the materials for the strategies, is that we have to remember that if we are communicating to them, it can be at a higher level, because we understand at a higher level of comprehension than we do demonstrate. So it's just something to really keep in mind, that it just really connects to presuming competence. Like, even if a kid can't verbally tell you that they're understanding, it doesn't mean that they're not understanding. And to make sure that we, honor the integrity of the curriculum and the integrity of the student, to say, I may not know what you're getting out of this, but I do know that, like, I've never met a kid who can't tell me if they're not getting something out of it. And so I think it's really just trusting the process and knowing that kids are understanding even if we don't know it. And so just to kind of keep that in mind when you're creating access points, I guess the point is, don't make them too accessible or too babyish, because, as kids get older into high school, they're going to know and they're not going to like it. Another way to create access points is to target vocabulary. You can learn about the ABCs with apples, bananas, and, what's a C word? Chocolate. Just like, those books that you get at the bookstore, and they're like board books, and they're just not appropriate. You could also learn the alphabet using, like, I can't think of any examples. Like Napoleon, and you could talk about democracy, and you could talk about Canada. Like, there's so many words that also start with the first letters of the alphabet. So I guess, like, vocabulary is such a good place to start because, every course, every grade, every subject area has vocabulary. And if you can target the concrete and visual text and vocabulary words within a unit, that's such a nice in for all kids. And so if you can kind of create goals that look at those particular types of vocabulary, you realize that kids can learn about language without it being babyish. I'm going to show you another a resource that's on my website that I'll attach to this video strategy. It's connected to Bloom's taxonomy. And I know we've all heard about Bloom's taxonomy, but I didn't really realize how useful it was until I started creating access points, because often goals that are written at grade level, as they increase in grade, often it's just the verb that changes. So you'll say, for example, move from a knowledge-based goal to like an evaluation type goal as kids get older. So often if kids are in classes, you can just change the verb to a more accessible version of the same goal. So like one example was, evaluate whether Napoleon is a good leader. Well, you could just change the verb to, choose if Napoleon is a good leader, and then it becomes a yes or no question. And so, if you just change those verbs to really accessible or change those goals to really accessible verbs around matching and choosing and identifying and listing, often it automatically becomes accessible. And so I have I have a resource I'm going to show you next. Earlier grade levels can help. Good curriculum that's written really well is actually quite spiraled. Like, there's big ideas that you can find themes and ties all the way, like from K to 12. I know that one of my best resources when I was working at a high school was connecting to my primary teacher. Not because I'm teaching primary goals, but because primary teachers in earlier grade levels are really, really good references for big ideas, because if you think about curriculum in kindergarten, it's actually not easier, it's bigger. Like, if you think about a kindergarten concept like what is change, that's not a simple concept at all, but it depends what content you use to teach that big idea with. And so if you're ever not sure about a big idea or why we're doing what we're doing, often you can find the answer in K to 3. And so to have a primary teacher like in your little like Rolodex of resources to say, hey, I'm teaching linear relations, like, why is this important? I do that all the time, especially in high school. The other good strategy in this is really useful, a question to ask if you're having this conversation with a curricular teacher is, if this is the grade level goal or the grade band goal, what do you need to be able to know or do to be able to understand this, which just gets to the prior knowledge question. And what I love about that one is that if you can connect it to the grade level goal, which was what we're trying to do, it's so obvious that the whole class is going to benefit from that. And so, it just kind of scaffolds that learning even more. So this is, this is the resource. It's the Bloom's taxonomy kind of teacher planning kit, and you can see along the top are the Bloom's taxonomy categories, but you can see there's keywords here and action words, and they actually have examples of questions. And so this has been a really, really good resource for me. And like I say, I'll put this in the website where you can get the template, but it's such a helpful tool. So if you can find goals in curriculum that use kind of like the upper level thinking, analysis, synthesis, evaluation, and change the verb, you've like all of a sudden made some really complex curriculum really accessible. And, it's actually going to benefit probably a lot of kids, because it's really hard to evaluate if you don't have the knowledge to do it. Okay, I only showed you a few examples. I have way more examples. So on not the 5 More Minutes website, but the Blog Some More website, there is a whole section called Learning Maps. And this is a lot of the work I do, especially in British Columbia with our new curriculum. And even if you're not in BC, this is going to be helpful, because every learning map that is uploaded on there is looking at grade level curricular goals, and every single one of them have an access point for a student in mind. And so, if you just want to see what this looks like at a unit level or a classroom level, there are examples from K to 12. And so definitely go go check that out, because it's been a huge goal of mine, to plan for kids before they get there. And what that means is not just socially or behaviorally, but also in terms of curriculum. Because I find, the more the kids are planned for, the less behavior you're going to have, and the more support the whole classroom is going to have, because, we assume that kids are coming ready. Nobody's ready. And so we have to support all kids to kind of get to the place where they need to be so they can be learning. So that is the replacement curriculum goal planner. We're going to hashtag that one access points, because this is really what we're talking about is, how do we create access to curriculum in a way that's not like just, integration strategies, but how do we kind of make curriculum accessible to kids, but with still having a common goal as their peers. And this is my research area, and so I'm doing my data collection right now, and this is exactly what we're trying to do is how do you, in high school academic classes, make these access points that are beneficial, like they're designed specifically for individuals, but are going to benefit all the learners, which is just exactly, what universal design for learning is. So my friends, thank you for joining me. We're going to take a break because it's Christmas and we all need a little break. So the next release of content is going to be January 7th, where we have a new 5 more minute video for you. And then we'll just keep building on these strategies, because I just think the more that we can, actually have some useful tools to make this happen, the more we're going to make this inclusion revolution happen. So thanks for joining me today. I hope that you all have a wonderful break, and I will see you soon. The 5 More Minutes video strategy is written and developed by Shelley Moore and produced by Paul Madsen.